Hi, everybody. Did everybody have lunch? Feeling good? No food coma? Okay, so I only have one slide, so I don't have a structured presentation per se. I don't know exactly what I'm going to tell you, but if you have any questions or anything doesn't make sense while I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me. And I mean that. So I got out of college and I was working in construction. And I was in upstate New York, and I was actually working in construction. I was working like 16, 17, 18-hour days some days. And that in itself is not a particularly healthy lifestyle, but I was also eating fast food a couple times a day, smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, drinking a lot, just because that was part of the culture, and not sleeping very much, and I was completely stressed out of my mind. So by the time I was 23, I got diagnosed with Crohn's disease. Now, who knows what Crohn's disease is? Okay. Some of you may know what colitis is too. They're very similar. So if you don't know, Crohn's is a chronic inflammatory condition that affects the digestive tract. It's considered to be incurable. It's extremely painful and not very, very well understood. There's so many different factors that go into it that even with the dozens of Crohn's people that I've worked with, there's never really one thing that you can identify that has some effect, but of course that's why we quantify things, right? So I was put on a lot of medicine. I was taking at one point 16 pills a day, including a leukemia drug, which was pretty horrible, and I was getting sicker and sicker and weaker and weaker. And I got to this place where I had previously been working these 16, 18-hour days, and now I was so weak and so sick and so just debilitated that I got to this situation where I literally could not do more than about an hour of work a day. So I got to a particularly low point where I was in the hospital, and I felt that I was this particular night I believed I was going to die. And I got through the night, I spiked 105-degree fever, I was delirious for a couple days, and then I turned things around. And I went on a long journey of self-tracking and self-experimentation for the first time in my life. After 4 months, I got off my meds completely, and three months after that, I competed in my first triathlon. And then I set my sights on Ironman France after that, which was a year and a half after this event. And through that extreme fitness journey and all this quantification, all the self-tracking, I basically was declared cured of an incurable disease. Now the way that the 1 hour of work comes into it is that I realized very quickly that the food, the nutrition, the supplements, and the exercise aspects of my illness, as well as how other people who were dealing with this, was pretty straightforward. You can tell somebody, eat this food and take these supplements and do these exercises, and they can do them, or not, but they do them. To tell somebody, manage your stress less, that's a lot harder to do, right? And we already there's a couple devices here that actually help you quantify and do that, but that's where I created an entirely new system of productivity. So I don't have the clicker. Can we just go to the next slide? It's the only slide. So there we go. Thank you. So less doing is my system of productivity. I'm not going to cover all of this. This is the kind of overview. And the idea is less doing, more living. So I basically wanted to teach people how to optimize, automate, and outsource everything in their lives, including their health, in order to be more effective. A lot of what I do is about setting limits. And in this case, this was a time limit. This was an energy limit, right? And if you're going to tell somebody, look, you can't work on Fridays, but you can work the other 4 days a week, that's a challenge, but that's definitely something that a lot of people can sort of wrap their heads around. But if you tell somebody you can only work 1 hour a day, that requires you stretching your brain to a place that outside the box doesn't even describe it. Right, so that's why I had to create this entirely new system. And so it's sort of a confluence of trying to create extreme time management and also manage stress at the same time. So kind of fits in very nicely. And then there are 9 fundamentals to the system, which are here. And the first one is the 80-20 rule. which is not my creation. People probably heard that before, but for me, I use this as a reminder to constantly be self-tracking. And then the capstone at the end is wellness. Because I believe no matter how technologically or procedurally efficient I might be able to help somebody become, if you're not eating right or sleeping well or you have way too much stress, you're just not going to be as effective as you want to be. So, in the limited time that we have, I want to cover a topic that I've been kind of obsessed with lately. There's research that shows that in order to grow as an individual or as a company, you need to be offloading 70% of what you do every year. So that's a hard concept. Actually, and this may be a little more acceptable to this community here in Europe, but at least in America, this is a really hard concept for people to let go of because, especially I think in America, there's, unfortunately, a lot of people tie their identity to their work. And as such, we have a lot of trouble letting go of the things that we do every day. And everybody wants to feel like all the things that they do are so important and indispensable. And that's really small thinking. That's actually a really bad way to think about things, and it doesn't allow you to grow and to think of other ways of doing things. So, actually, and further to that point, people want to feel like they're irreplaceable. The problem with being irreplaceable is that if you can't be replaced, then you can't be promoted, right? Because nobody else can sort of fill that position. So you have to get in this mindset that 70% of the things that you're doing every year, you shouldn't be doing them next year. And honestly, the only way to figure that out is to quantify and track a lot of the things that we do. Now, I agree. I mean, I think everyone who's presented today is fascinating. And Ben Greenfield and I particularly, I've known him for a while, and I really do agree with both sides of this sort of argument that you can track like everything and then you can also sort of have the nature side as well. Personally, I don't track like in hardcore data a lot of stuff anymore. I feel like I've gotten to a point because of all the stuff that I've done that I have more of a sense of things. One of the benefits of doing this kind of work, I feel like, is that you get better at sensing your environment and sensing your abilities. So, the 70%. Now, there are ways that you can, I'm sure a lot of you actually know these, but there's ways that you can track the way that you use your computer, the way that you spend your time, where you spend the most time, and you can pretty easily identify when you're being efficient or not, and sort of, when you're wasting time or not. What a lot of people don't know is that, and this is a relatively new concept, each of us has a period of the day, every day, that's about 90 minutes, and it's called peak time, or prime time, depending on what research you look at. And in that time, you are 2 to 100 times more effective than any other time of the day. Now, this is not my opinion, this is research-based. So, first of all, if I don't tell you anything else about that, that gets very close to that question of what would you do if you could only work an hour a day, right? Because if you're 2 to 100 times more effective in that 90-minute period, then on the high scale of that, you might be able to get more done in in that 90-minute period than you could in an entire week. But the key is actually knowing when that peak time is. So, just anybody randomly, do you have anyone have a sense of when they feel like their peak time is? When?
From 6 to 8.
In the morning?
Yeah.
6 to 8 in the morning. Okay.
Yeah, okay, that's correct at 2 hours, but I need a lot of time to prepare, to get the knowledge of different things which I should decide during that time.
Okay, that's fair. By the way, to clarify, the peak time is basically when you're in a flow state more easily than any other time. It's when you do your highest and best work, typically. So anybody else have a time idea? Max?
11 p.m. to 1 a.m.
Okay, good. 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. Good. I wanted somebody who had a nighttime one. And anybody feel like it's like in the middle of the night, like they wake up at like 3 or 4 in the morning and they feel like they have so many thoughts going? You?
I peak day, Tuesday, or the whole day.
The whole day is Tuesday. All day Tuesday.
I do all week work on Tuesday.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so again, you may have an idea of when your peak time is and you may not, but mine happens to be from 10 to noon, typically. And actually, I'll speak to your point in a second too, which I appreciate you bringing that up. A lot of people I find, and again, this is a more enlightened crowd because we're at a biohacking summit, but a lot of people tend to think that it's around 9 in the morning, and typically that's coffee. And that's not actually your peak time. And depending on, again, if some of you have done genetic markers to find out if you're a fast caffeine metabolizer or not, anyone done that? No one okay. So I'm a fast caffeine metabolizer. So caffeine is out of me in about 25 to 30 minutes and has no use. Fortunately, I really like the taste of coffee. But the thing about caffeine is that it will actually go kind of overboard. It'll make you more sort of jittery and actually less focused. So there's a couple ways to figure this out, and I've worked through this. And you guys are actually the first to hear about what I'm about to share. I'm working on my first app, which is going to be extremely simple, and it's not really using, it's not a new technology, but I'm using it for something new. So who knows what the Cns Tap Test is? Okay, just a couple of you. So it stands for Central Nervous System Tap Test. Now, you've heard a lot about heart rate variability today, and probably know about it from way before today. And heart rate variability is fantastic. The CNS Tap Test is related in some ways. It's really interesting. So basically, to perform the CNS Tap Test, you simply tap your finger on a table, or whatever, as fast as you can, for 10 seconds. Okay? And you count the number of taps. And most people, it's going to be between like 50 and 80, depending on how fast you are. It's a surprisingly good corollary to the health and recovery state of your nervous system. Just that simple tap test. So just as you might use HRV to decide in the morning, I'm going to make today a yoga day, or I'm going to make today a high-intensity interval training day, you actually can use the CNS Tap Test in a similar way. So I had this hypothesis, and it's proved to be accurate with a lot of people. If you do the CNS Tap Test every hour of the workday, so 8 times in the day basically, for a few days, or a couple times a week for a few weeks, you will actually be able to use that to identify your peak time. And the difference in taps should not be too significant, but with enough of that data, you'll be able to see some sort of statistical difference. So, by the way, now I realize why all the speakers were standing here. It's finally no light in my eyes. So, there's other ways to sort of estimate it, but that's actually a really accurate way. So, yes?
Does it matter if you're dominant or non-dominant?
Good question. So the question is, does it matter if you use your dominant or non-dominant hand? It shouldn't. And if there's a difference, they'll be relative. So as long as you're sticking with one, you'll be fine. If you do both, you should also see some sort of correlation. But I don't have enough data to know if this is right or not yet, but of course you can also say left brain, right brain, and maybe there's a peak time for one versus the other, which would be really interesting. Because to be honest, we all have a bio sort of rhythm and different times that we do different things better than we do others. And I tell you personally, I cannot do any kind of creative work before 8 o'clock at night. And that could be because the kids are asleep and it's quieter, and we tend to be more creative when we're tired or drunk, but it's a little hard to get things on paper then. So it's very freeing for me to know that, because if I have a creative task to do, or somebody asks me to do something that might be creative at 10 in the morning or whatever, I can just push that off to 8 o'clock at night, and I don't have to worry about it or think about it, because I know that if I tried to do it at 11 in the morning, that's when I would end up on Facebook or something, and I wouldn't actually write the thing that I needed to write, and if I did, it would be of poor quality. So it's a very good question about the right hand versus left, or the dominant versus non-dominant. If you don't want to do that level of quantification, you do a slightly less accurate but also helpful metric, which is that you just have a piece of paper that says energy and focus, and you have 1 to 10, or 1 to 10 and 1 to 10. And then you can do that every hour. And you just self-report every hour what you feel your energy is and what you feel your focus is. And this is an interesting one when you talk about coffee, because a lot of people will have coffee and then they'll feel very energized, but if they're being honest with themselves, they're probably not feeling very focused. They're a little bit all over the place, right? So, okay, so this is the concept of peak time. And again, if you use this effectively, this is the important thing, is that once you identify your peak time, you have to respect it. And if you're working in a team, and even in a relationship in some cases, it's very, very helpful to know what the peak time of your team is. If you know that John in the marketing department, whatever, his peak time is 2 to 4 in the afternoon, then you don't want to bother him at 2:30 with a stupid phone call or an email or something like that. I mean, I've done this. I work with companies, I work with individuals, and seeing the jump in productivity from people when they do this kind of thing is amazing. If you're lucky enough to have a small enough team that you can actually coordinate meetings that don't intersect with anybody's peak time, you're going to be really amazed. But that's a little harder to do, and also just a little less necessary. But I truly believe that 95% of the things that we do on a daily basis can be done by other people or other things. And it's that 5% that only you can do and do better than anybody else that I want you to be able to focus on. And that's what you need to be doing in that peak time, is that 5%, whatever that might be. Whether it's writing or strategizing or whatever it is that is your sort of unique ability. And you have to be able to identify that. So that's extremely powerful knowledge. And so to go back to your point about Tuesday being your peak day. So my work week is Mondays and Wednesdays from 9:30 to 2:30. So it's not the 4-hour work week. But that is a restriction that I placed on myself a long time ago. And what it does is something very important. So this concept of multitasking, do I have to convince you guys that that doesn't really exist? Well, okay, because multitasking does not exist. All you're really doing is rapidly switching back and forth between tasks. And women are marginally better at it than men, which probably has to do something with pain tolerance. But it's exhausting. It's really, really exhausting. It actually works on the same part of our brain, the central governor that controls respiration and heart rate when we're working out. Incidentally, it's one of the reasons why running on a treadmill tends to be so much more tiring than running it out in nature, because not only are you physically exerting yourself, but you're being presented with a lot of data at the same time. I actually just read an article this morning that the treadmill was originally developed as a torture device. I'm not kidding, actually, and that it somehow got adopted to the fitness industry. So, anyway, so my work week is those 2 days. Now, I'm an entrepreneur. I love what I do. I'm very passionate about what I do. So I'm always thinking about this stuff, and I'm always living it. I have 3 small children. I work from home for the most part. So I've basically made it a priority for myself to spend as much time as I can with them as possible. And then that incidentally puts me into situations where I have to figure out ways to be more productive. But those 2 days are sort of the whole flow day for me. Now, still, that 10 to noon time for me is that prime time. But in a day that's 9:30 to 2:30, I might have 11 appointments back to back, phone calls, interviews for my podcast, whatever it might be. And it's extremely powerful to see the difference in those days. And by the way, to just frame this in sort of a general way, I'm really talking about biorhythms and understanding the way that we do things when we do them. In those 6 hours or whatever, I don't eat. It doesn't even occur to me to eat. It's like I'm living 2 different lives in some cases, and I just blast through it. But when you're in that flow state, every minute that you take away from that flow state, so if you distract yourself with a task that you really shouldn't be doing or an activity that you shouldn't be, it takes about 23 minutes to get back into that flow state. So the opportunity cost is enormous. So again, all this to say that 90-minute period is super important. So I would really implore you to try to figure out when that is and try to really maximize that. Now, on a slightly unrelated note, as I said, I'm not actively tracking a lot of stuff right now. There's kinds of things that happen passively with me right now. But one of the things that I've struggled with for a very long time is sugar addiction. So does anybody have that problem ever? You can admit it, it's okay. So I believe that this actually happened to me as a result of Ironman training. Now, I didn't know Ben at the time, because if I did, I would have been able to train in about a third of the time I was actually spending. I was doing about 25 hours a week training, and I think Ben can do it in 8. So the problem was that I didn't know as much as I know now about nutrition and quantifying all this stuff, and I was eating about 10,000 calories, well, 9 to 10,000 calories a day, and about 85% carbs. So I'm pretty certain that when I stopped that ridiculous diet, pretty much the day after Ironman, and I was in France, by the way, which is not a place you want to be when you don't want to eat carbs, my body was like, whoa, where's all the sugar? Come on. So, and I basically, I think, broke that mechanism in myself. So since then, and this is 4 years now, I still have a sugar addiction issue. And by the way, all this relates to peak time as well. But for me, it comes out in situations where there's stress or just being mindless, right? So as we just heard about mindfulness, that definitely applies to the way we eat. So I found something really interesting that not only was a way of tracking this, but also breaking the habit. So anyone familiar with Evernote? Good, Evernote. No? Okay, well Evernote is just a free online note-taking application. You can take notes in any form you want, basically, text, audio, web snippets, whatever. But that's not the point. There's an app that goes along with it called the Do button. Actually, it's not specifically Evernote. It's by a company called Ifttt. So anybody know what the Do button is? Yes. Okay, one person. Okay, you guys are going to love this. So the Do button is... Don't start. So the Do button, there's a company called Ifttt. Actually, that's another one. Do you guys know Ifttt? Okay, good. That is like Biohacker Central. Not explicitly, but because of what it allows you to do, you can automate so many different interactions. So, sorry, for those who don't know what Ifttt is, it stands for if this, then that. So if this happens here, do this here. Very simple stuff. If I post a photo on Instagram of my food, then put it into my calendar, which is extremely helpful for tracking stuff. If I by geolocation, if I enter my house, then add a note to a Google Docs spreadsheet saying that I was home, so you have like a timeline. There's a lot of things you can do that you can sort of create these duct tape together ways of tracking things. So the Do button is really cool. What it is it basically, it's an app for the iPhone and Android, and you are actively deciding to push a button, on the screen, and it will record something, or it will do whatever you want. So you could have it turn off the lights in your house if you want, if you have a Wemo remote. Or, what I do is you can have it make a note in Evernote. So I'm just going to pull this up real quick. You're not going to be able to really see it, but so all I have to do, and I'll explain how this works, but if you can sort of see that, it's just a button. And it actually, I think it'll say sugar tracker for a second. Yeah, there you go. So if I push that, there's no Wi-Fi on my phone right now, but so that's done. So basically what I did with this was I started to, every time I had a sugar craving, I would push the button. And my initial thought was, I'm going to try to just figure out when and where this is happening. So what that was doing is it was putting a timestamp and a map into Evernote. So I have this Evernote note now with block, all the times that I push the button. One of the things that I've always found so interesting about all the quantified self movement is that, none of us, but the majority of the people in this room, myself included, we're not data scientists, right? So we have all this data available to us now, but a lot of people don't know what to do with it. And I don't know what to do with a lot of it sometimes. And not only do you not know what to do with the data once you have it, but since we're not data scientists, most of us can't go into an experiment thinking what the correlation is going to be, right? That's kind of the challenge in a lot of cases. One thing to track it, it's another thing to make it actionable. So I went into this just thinking, look, I'm going to just figure out when and where I'm getting these cravings, which I did, which was interesting. And I found that it was only happening in like a 3-hour span of the day, between 4 and 7, which is reasonably a sort of a low blood sugar point. But also, how many people have kids? Right, okay, so I don't know if this applies here as well, but between 5 and 7 is like the worst time of the day for kids. We call it the witching hour. My kids just turn into like Tasmanian devils every single day for that 2-hour period. It's insane. Okay, so that could have had something to do with it. But what I didn't expect was that this actually would help disrupt the behavior. because there was a mindlessness aspect to what was happening. You know, I would get stressed out or something, and I might grab a pastry or a donut or something at a store that I was at, and I was out with the kid, whatever. But it was completely mindless. And I almost wouldn't even recognize until after I'd eaten it that it was something that I didn't want to eat. And again, you know, I can go into all the woes of sugars if you want, but essentially for me, for Crohn's, what I found was that a high-fat, low-sugar diet was extremely helpful for the illness. So I really, really try to avoid sugar as much as possible. So it actually disrupted the behavior, and it almost became a game. So when I got that craving, which was honestly was very hard to control. And the weirdest thing about this for me is that I don't have an addictive personality at all, either genetically or emotionally. I smoked a pack of cigarettes a day for 3 years, and I put down my last cigarette. I never had another one. It just never even occurred to me. You know, so I do not have that aspect. But the sugar thing was always really crazy to me, and it's still something that comes up with me every now and then. But this replaced the behavior in some way. Not only was I taking a second to remind myself, basically, that I was doing something I didn't want to do, but I was actually taking control of the situation. And pushing the button became the thing that would then, I think, would trigger that dopamine release. So if you haven't been familiar with IFTTT and the do button particularly, I think this is something that's really, really useful to this community. Because one of the nice things about all these devices that we have now and all the things that are available to us, of course, is that they're passive. But I think that there's something interesting about actually taking an active role in tracking things sometimes as well. And this one is one of those, especially if you're trying to change behavior. There's actually, it's funny because anyone know what the Pavlok is? Have you heard of the Pavlok? There's a few of you. So the Pavlok is, I think they're actually shipping them right now, but I tested a unit about a year ago. It's a self-administered, it's a wristband, and it can do 3 things. It can beep, it can vibrate, and it can shock you. And so you can use that for whatever behavior you want, whether that's stopping smoking, not eating sugar, or breaking a porn addiction, depending on what you want to use it for. So anyway, this is my own version, basically. Does that make sense, everybody, by the way? Everything so far? I know I'm sort of jumping around a little bit, but I wanted to tie in all these topics together. Okay, so, that's the Pavlok. Thanks. Can we go back to the other slide, whoever was doing that? Okay, so the 4th fundamental of my system is choose your own work week. And as I said to you before, my work week is Mondays and Wednesdays. Now, the way that this came about for me was that when I was in college, I ended up graduating a year early, and to do that, I had to take a lot of extra classes. And for my last 2 semesters, I was taking classes just 2 days a week, but it was like 7 hours straight. And actually, it was kind of funny because I got to a point where I had like 4 classes, and then I basically was just looking for classes that fit the time slot. So I inadvertently ended up with minors in psychology and art history. But it was a really interesting idea because this question again of what would you do if you only work an hour a day is fascinating to me. And I don't want you to only work an hour a day, but I do want you to use your time better than most people would use it. So you have to think about when those times are best for you, because you, for example, when Tuesday is your peak day, what if you only work Tuesdays?
Well, I think that it wouldn't work on that day.
Okay.
Because on Monday I'm done, because the weekend is over, and then I'm preparing Tuesday. Without a bad Monday, I wouldn't have a good Tuesday.
Okay, fair enough. But then you might not need Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So think about the limits that you might be able to put on yourself, the limits you might be able to put in your life and your work, not just time. Yes?
How do you keep track of, because you've got inputs on Monday, Friday, or Saturday, how do you go about when your maximum 4 hours starts?
Right.
What kind of system do you use?
Okay, so first, well, and so we're talking about work again, obviously, here. So the first thing to say is that when I say that my work week is 9:30 to 2:30, it doesn't mean that I'm never thinking about work outside of those hours. That's just absurd. Because, by the way, work-life balance I don't think exists. It's work-life integration. We don't like take off a cape when we get home, and even if you did, you're still technically the same person. So this idea of like we're separate people just doesn't work. So what people don't understand is that mental preparation is not necessarily something that you can actually turn on and off, and it's going to happen almost autonomically, right? A lot of that stuff actually should be on autopilot, and it is in most cases. So yes, you could say that Monday, you need the Monday to prepare, but you don't necessarily know that if you've tried not doing it, because all this is about experimentation, right? So you have to see what that work output is. But yes, of course, we're a holistic person, but what if your Saturday was spent doing a completely different activity that maybe fueled your brain in a different way, in your body and mind? And I'm not just talking about like relaxing for the weekend, but you decide like what you actually want to do with your time, what might be enriching, and that actually can contribute to what you're talking about. So it's not necessarily that the Monday is kind of like the crappy beginning to the week and then we can really get into it. It might be that actually not using that time for something that we're not meant to use it for is what can contribute to it the best. But again, one of the ways to quantify this really is something like peak time, tap test, HRV to some extent will actually show you sort of which days you are better and which are not. But again, it's also based on the kind of activity. So you also have to decide like what is your highest and best use and such. And in that peak time, by the way, this is another thing. It's a 90-minute period, but how many people are familiar with the Pomodoro Technique? Okay. So for those who aren't, Pomodoro Technique is a very simple productivity method that basically says that our brains work better in sprints than in marathons. And what it means in practice is that you set a timer for 25 minutes in a classic Pomodoro, and you go to work on ideally one task very intently and very focused. And at the 25-minute mark, the bell goes off, and you take a break for 5 minutes. And then you come back and you do it again. And that 30-minute period, the 25-minute work and 5-minute break is considered a Pomodoro. So you give yourself an X, a check mark, whatever you want, whether it's on a piece of paper or on a computer, doesn't matter. The point is actually that you're disassociating yourself to some extent from the specific work and really just giving yourself a check because you did work. So what that means at the end of the day is if you've done 6 or 7 Pomodoros, then you can say, okay, great, tomorrow I want to do 7 Pomodoros, or I want to do 7 Pomodoros every day this week, for example. But what's interesting about Pomodoros is that you can play around with the ratio of what that work to rest is. So a lot of people don't know that. So personally, when I actually do a Pomodoro, I usually do a 15-minute work period to a 5-minute rest period. But what they've found that for certain people, specifically coders, the ideal work to rest ratio is 51 minutes of work to 17 minutes of rest. So fortunately, somebody quantified and figured that out for you, because that would have been really annoying to try to figure that out. And the basis there is that in a 51-minute period, you can just do a lot of significant work, and then 17 minutes is considered a actually like decent break. And on that note about the break, there is something called the Zeigarnik Effect. Bet none of you know what that is. Okay. So the Cigar Neck Effect, this is one of my favorite sort of psychological things, and a lot of people have never heard of this. Oh, and by the way, this just reminded me too, just in case you don't know how I'm spelling something or you're worried about like taking notes, I made a special webpage for all of you. So if you go to lessdoing.com/BHS15, then a lot of the notes or the services and apps that I mentioned are on that page. I can mention that again at the end. So the Zeigarnik Effect. In the 1920s, Bluma Zeigarnik was a Russian doctoral student in Berlin. And she was studying something having to do with psychology, but not this yet. And she was at a restaurant, and she became keenly aware that all of the waiters in this restaurant were very cognizant of all of the open checks. But once a check had closed out, they had completely forgotten. It was like no knowledge of it whatsoever. So she used this to hypothesize that we have a different part of our brains that processes open-ended information. So what she did was she created this experiment. She took two groups of students, and they were set to study, basically. So they were studying for exams. So one group was left to study on their own, and the other group was set, they were told to study, but then they were systematically interrupted throughout their study period. Simple interruptions. Somebody would come into the room and say, is everyone okay in here? Can I get you some water or strudel or whatever they were eating in 1920s in Berlin? And the group that got interrupted did statistically significantly better on their exams. By the way, this is one of the reasons that I love when people ask me questions while I'm speaking, because it kind of helps. I go in and out of it. And so basically she cemented the hypothesis that when we are interrupted, when information is interrupted, it goes into this separate part of our brain, and it is then more easily recalled from that part of our brains. So that is one part of the Zeigarnik effect. But this is why the Pomodoro Technique tends to work so well. When that bell goes off, you actually have to interrupt yourself, and then you can get right back into it once you've had that little bit of a rest. So that's one part of it. The other part, though, is that the Zeigarnik effect is also the voice in our heads that pushes us to complete the uncompleted. So we as human beings have a natural tendency towards seeking closure. Even the worst procrastinators still benefit and enjoy finishing things at some point. So the Zeigarnik effect is that voice in our heads that's telling us to finish the unfinished. And which is really interesting if you know that, because you need to be able to single task when you're doing things. As I said before, you cannot multitask. So single tasking is actually one of the only ways to really effectively get something done, even if you only do it for 5 minutes. Now, Pomodoro is 25, so that would be great too. But as long as you can focus on one thing for a short amount of time, you're going to maximize your effectiveness. Again, don't try to multitask. Our brains are just not set up for this. All of the data and stuff and all the devices that we have, it's not going to make up for the fact that we've just not evolved biologically as quickly as we have technologically. We can't keep up with it. So if you're single tasking and you're focusing, that's great. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that to-do lists are really, really bad for people's productivity. So anybody have a to-do list on a whiteboard? Okay. Hopefully you'll stop doing that after I tell you this. That's not the only bad place. You don't want to-do lists in general, because this is the problem with the to-do list. Most to-do lists have things on them that you can't do right now, right? I mean, most of the things on a to-do list are things you can't do right now, either because you need to hear from somebody else first, or because it's too big of a project. I've actually seen this now 3 times on somebody's to-do list: write book. That's ridiculous, right? Write book is not a task. It's not even a goal, honestly. Like, publish book might be the goal, but write book is just absurd. So this is the problem with the to-do list, is that you look at this list of all these things that you can't do right now, and that Zeigarnik effect works against us. And it tells you have to get all these things done, but you can't get them done. It creates cognitive dissonance, which we basically can't turn 2 wrongs into a right, and it shuts down your productivity. Because all it ends up doing is showing you everything that you're not getting done. Okay, so the whiteboard is the worst offender because it's like right there in your face. Now, having like a thing that you're going to do right now and do that, for the next 15 minutes or something, or even better is having something in your calendar at a specific time when you know that you will most effectively deal with it now that you're going to learn what your peak time is. That's the best thing you can do, because then you can be in that time, in that mode to do that, and you can actually get it done. Because all of this stuff, all the negative stuff, it's a building up of, it builds on itself. The effect gets much worse and much worse, obviously, because the more that we're telling ourselves that we're not getting this stuff done, then the more stress it creates, and then it actually makes people sort of shy away from it, and then your HRV numbers just drop through the bucket.
I don't want to be interrupted. If I interrupt on that.
Yes.
Yes. I had to do this. I hate the whiteboard, so when I put one in my office and I've taken it down. But in the Getting Things Done system, familiar with that, you don't look at the to-do list all the time. You should just get all the stuff off your schedule onto your to-do list and just review it once a week into actionable items. So do you have a problem with that? Because that's going to take it out of your mind. That's the whole idea. Get out of consciousness. Right. So I completely agree with creating the external brain. David Allen and I have actually had this conversation on a podcast. So the GTD system, who's familiar with the GTD system? Getting Things Done? Okay, a few of you.
So if you're not, it's this productivity system called Getting Things Done. And so GTD tends to work very, very well for people who are already kind of systems minded. And the fact that a lot of you have not heard of it is actually not surprising. It works extremely well for the people that it works extremely well for. And it works it actually works in the opposite way for a lot of people. But that element of it is absolutely correct. You want to offload this stuff as much as possible and put it into a to-do list is not the right way to call it. You really want items to be at the time that you can actually do them. So either putting one item in your calendar at the time you think you can do it, or there's a service called followup.cc, which I recommend above any productivity tool. It's a free, I think it's free to some extent, email service. And all you do with it is you can send an email to any time period you want at followup.cc. So whatever program you're using, whether it's Gmail or your iPhone or a BlackBerry, it doesn't matter. You send an email to 3 days at followup.cc. Or 8 p.m. at followup.cc, or Monday 2 a.m. at followup.cc, whatever you want, any time period you want at followup.cc. And then you send it and you forget about it. And what happens is that at that time, when that time comes around, you'll get that email back in your inbox as a reminder. And it will now include a snooze functionality to it. So this is actually a really fascinating way not only to make tasks very time relevant, but also to learn the best time to do those things. So if I think, for example, that I get something like the creative thing I said before about working after 8 p.m. If at 9 in the morning, I write for various publications like the Daily Beast and a couple others. And so if I get an email from an editor of the Daily Beast at 9 in the morning, they're like, Ari, we'd really like you to write an article on the quantified self movement. I'm not even going to finish reading it. I'm going to forward that to 8 p.m. at followup.cc and completely forget about it and free my mind of it. Because then 8 p.m. rolls around and I'm now in a creative mode, that email comes in and I can actually effectively deal with it. But if I'm wrong, and 8 p.m. is not my time to do that, then it has this built-in snooze functionality, which is so cool, because then I can say, all right, well, now's not the right time. Maybe I need to do some research first, whatever. I'm going to put this off till Thursday at 8 p.m. or Thursday at 6 p.m. if I haven't figured out when my creative time is. So it's actually really cool because you can use it as a service to identify the best times to do different things. It's really fascinating that way. And again, it's a free service for a certain amount of usage. So that's one really great way. By the way, you can use that for follow-ups with people too. So if you send an email to somebody and you're like, hey, it was great meeting you, let's talk next week, you can actually put 1 week at followup.cc in the BCC field and never forget to follow up with somebody again, and also not take up that space in your brain. Because why would we want to do that? Yeah, I think that effectively answers that. Okay, so we've got about 3 minutes left. Is there another question though before I continue? Because I want to wrap up with one other point. Okay, good. So one of the nice things about this too, about offloading that stuff and getting this stuff out of your brain and thinking about how you can offload that 70%, is that ideas really do need this flow to them. So actually this is interesting because this is one of the ways that you can use followup.cc and Ifttt, which I mentioned before. I created a very rudimentary food tracker for myself a couple years ago and found some really interesting things with it. But basically what I was doing was I was taking pictures with Instagram, I think it was Instagram at the time, and if I tagged it with the word food, Ifttt would see that, and it would basically trigger it to send that photo to 3 hours at followup.cc. And it would ask the question, how do you feel? So basically what would happen is I would eat something, I'd take a picture of it, and 3 hours later I'd get that email with the picture and say, how do you feel now? And I didn't graph the results, I didn't aggregate that data. It was one of the most powerful things I ever did was that information, because I figured out pretty quickly that this high-fat diet and low sugar was basically what was working for me, because it's so easy, again, with all the things that are happening and all the information that's coming to us, to forget about the things that we've actually done. And it's sort of, as Ben said, like it's really easy to sit in front of a blue light instead of taking the time to go outside and be in nature. So if you actually set up these systems in some cases, which might seem like they're less polished and they're not nice, perfect devices, which, by the way, I love them too. you can actually give yourself some more powerful information. And the thing that I'd like to end with is I cured an incurable disease, but I didn't come up with some magic correlation. I did take a lot of data, but I didn't figure out that my CRP levels were completely related to, a certain amount of sleep, and I didn't create this perfect formula. What I found, though, was that having that information and tracking it, whether I correlated it or not, was the powerful part. What I deal with in general with people as a productivity consultant and efficiency consultant is that so many people feel overwhelmed in their daily lives. And a lot of that overwhelm, I find, comes from people simply being unaware of the things that are causing the overwhelm. So by tracking this information, whether you do anything with it or not, just having that control gives us this sort of emotional and psychological power that we just wouldn't have in any other way. So you can really massively simplify these sometimes and get some pretty incredible results, like curing an incurable disease. So that's it. I hope everyone found that useful. Thank you very much. And remember that website, letsdoing.com/BHS15.